I would like to welcome our viewers to yet another episode 7 of the Black Archive Visual Podcast, which is made possible by the Harvard South African Fellowship Program run through the Center for African Studies here at Harvard University. For exciting events and all things Africa at Harvard, I encourage you to visit our website at www.africa.harvard.edu. Opportunities for fellowships, funding for undergraduate and graduate programs, as well as our exciting research and public engagement listings can be accessed on our website. My name is Sisego H. Kumalo, your host, a visiting fellow of the Harvard South African Fellowship Program and a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, where I teach on social and political philosophy, feminist and queer theory, decoloniality, and the Black Archive. And today I am joined by a colleague and admittedly my senior, Professor Milton Curry. And Milton has an extensive CV, so I'll try my best to kind of capture really the incredible guest that I have here today by introducing him briefly. Milton S.F. Curry is Professor of Architecture at the University of Southern California School of Architecture, where he was Dean and Della and Harry McDonald Dean's Chair in Architecture and Professor from 2017 to 2022. He is editor and founder of Critical Productive, a peer-reviewed academic journal on architecture, urbanism, and cultural theory, and principal of Milton Curry Project Studio, a multidisciplinary design consulting agency. Milton Curry is an accomplished academic leader, scholar, and designer. He obtained his Master in Architecture II degree with distinction from Harvard's Graduate School of Design in 1992, and his Bachelor of Architecture degree from Cornell University in 1988. He has held academic appointments at the University of Michigan, Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Strategic Planning, or Strategic Initiatives rather, at Cornell University in the Department of Architecture as Associate Professor of Architecture and Director of Cornell Council for the Arts, and at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design as Visiting Associate Professor. He worked at the offices of the KPF Architects New York prior to establishing his own design and research practice, Milton Curry Project Studio, where he has worked on projects in New York City, Ithaca, and Oakland, as well as exhibition projects. Milton Curry has edited and co-edited 6 serial volumes of the journal Critical Productive and Appendix Journal, respectively, and has authored influential essays and articles related to architecture, urbanism, cultural theory, aesthetics, and race. Dean Curry has lectured widely, most recently at the Architectural League of New York's 138th annual meeting, RIT Vignelli Center for Design Studies, Princeton University, Columbia Buell Center, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and the Venice Biennale, Architectural Biennale. He has organized symposia and conferences at Zonamoca, Mexico City, Design Miami, Cornell University, University of Michigan, and University of Southern California. He is a scholarly member of the Museum of Modern Art Trustee Acquisitions Committee on Architecture and Design, and a member of the Board of Directors and Finance Committee of Abode Communities. Milton, that is a really, really impressive CV. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to start us off maybe by considering a topic that I think is quite close to your heart, which looks at the nexus between space, memory, place, and culture. And I wonder if you'd have just a couple of introductory ideas on that before we dive into the meat of the conversation today.
Thank you, Susiko, for having me. It's an honor to be with you today in your audience. I'm a believer that architecture's greatest strength is linking issues of culture, identity, space, and place. It's really, as you said, it's a nexus of all that we do as humans, and ultimately architecture should be making us more human and putting us more in touch with fellow citizens than isolating us. And so I think the role of architecture that appeals to me, the definition of architecture that appeals to me, is one in which the architect is what I've termed a citizen architect, that the notion that architecture is as a professional practice, as a vocation, is isolated from the political and social milieu that we're in, is just really not uh, it's anathema to kind of what I see as the role of the architect. This an architect role is to be in the mix of all that. So I think when you talk about race and space and memory, I think architecture is a natural and consequential player in that whole field of relations.
Brilliant. And I think one of the things that one of the reasons why I bring up that particular question as the starting question is because of a contestation that we usually find, specifically in the arts, where we're kind of conceptualizing art for art's sake, right? There's this idea that when you're thinking about the aesthetic does not necessarily contain the political. And I think architecture is one area where we think seriously about the intersection of aesthetics with the political, right? How would you respond to the objection maybe that the aesthetic should not be sullied with the task of dealing with the political? And this, I ask this question necessarily as a South African, where as a South African, specifically as a black South African, the objection that we get from a lot of our white colleagues is always to say that, for instance, our disciplines should not necessarily venture into addressing maybe socio-political, socio-historical questions, right? So if you're doing philosophy, it's philosophy for philosophy's sake, knowledge for knowledge's sake. If you're working with the aesthetic, it's the aesthetic for the aesthetic's sake. So I wonder how, from an African American perspective, but also from your background in architecture, how you would respond to that particular objection that says that the aesthetic ought not be sullied with the political.
Well, it's a great question and one that I'm fully prepared to answer. And I think one answer to it is that we've seen far too often how history and historical narratives have been used to frame a certain disposition around the life we're living or the past that we're experiencing in the present, from the perspective of those who have colonized us or enslaved us or have marginalized us. And I think the wonderful aspect to theory uh, is that theory is a form of imagination. Theory is a toolkit to move beyond simply a historical narrative, historical interpretation, to something that is imaginative and projective and can even be aspirational, I would say. And so I think the idea of using cultural theory or architectural theory, of course, those can be embedded with systems and structures of colonization and enslavement as well. But I think they're more porous to interventions that allow them to be deployed to open up questions rather than to shut down questions and shut down interpretation. So I think the idea that the aesthetic or philosophy or literature are immune to the forces of the context in which those authors were shaped, in which their intellects were constructed, is theory has taught us and shown us that that simply is not true. So you can be at the end of the earth and isolated and believe that anything you're conceptualizing has no relation to anything else because you haven't been exposed to that. But we know that the relational effects of being human, the relational effects of being on our planet, of being in our climate, have massive impacts on how you think about thought itself, let alone the things that you implement from those thoughts. And so the idea that art or architecture or philosophy can be manufactured in a vacuum without those influences is, I think we have a wide body of research and theoretical inquiry that tells us that's simply not the case. And so I think the idea now is to be on the trajectory of being conscious and open about those things, whether you call them biases or intuitions or embedded structures of whatever they might be. We have to be conscious of the fact that they're there, and we can deal with them as tangible aspects of what it is that we're doing, the activities that we're undertaking, or we can simply ignore them and pretend that they're not there, which is what you're describing, where people say, why sully the activity with politics? Politics is already there. It's already there.
And the existence of politics, of course, shows up in the way in which we frame politics, either by denying that it exists, right, because we exist as a hegemonic identity that never always has to consider its political position, right? And when it is required to consider its political position, then it's this idea that we're sullying the project, whatever it might be, whether it be theory, whether it be literature, whether it be aesthetics itself, with the political, that objection really comes from the fact that we have to think critically about our own predisposition. And this brings me to a derivative question, Milton, from the response that you've just given about the importance of theory. And I'm curious about, and this is just an individual curiosity. I'm thinking here about the intersection between how we use theory necessarily to reinvent our worlds and to reimagine our worlds, but also how theory is an expression of language, and language then, of course, being the tool with which we invent the world. And I'm curious about how you would understand maybe or see language featuring into architectural theory, specifically because, you guys are dealing specifically with space, right? So I wonder how you negotiate that reality, or the realities rather, of space through language, in the sense of how do you possibly, for instance, say you're working on a particular project that's supposed to be surfacing a Black community. How does one bridge the gaps maybe between what our communities have always experienced historically versus what, for instance, projects that you are pioneering and are a part of are trying to do in terms of reimagining those spaces? So how does one then, in that instance, use language, and then in the language of academy, how does one use theory to conceptualize the realities of Blackness, whether it be located in the United States, whether it be located in Sierra Leone, in South Africa, or Nigeria? How does one bridge those gaps between academy, space, and our local communities, I wonder?
Well, I think language is essential. It's part of the, it's part of the baseline of how we communicate amongst ourselves. And so when you think of textual language, we think of the way in which syntax operates, the way in which meaning is transported through sentences, through words, through the combination of words. And so I think architecture is really, like many other disciplines and vocations, architecture is not so different. So we operate through language as well. There's a language of how typologies operate, types of buildings. We break that down into what are the constituent parts of, what's the language, the architectural language, the visual, spatial language that we're using to cohere a building into a church, right? And we could say there are constituent elements of that once you hit a certain threshold becomes a church, right? That becomes a commercial office building, et cetera. Some of those are symbolic, some of those are structural, some of those are visual, but they're all a part of the mix in terms of how you cohere the constituent parts of that language to make up, just as we would talk about, how many words to make up a sentence, to make up a paragraph, to make up a novel, et cetera. The same applies to buildings. I think where theory has helped us unpack that is through things like deconstruction, through things like feminism and other areas of cultural theory, where we've been able to say, well, why is the threshold where it is in terms of this paragraph or this work or this novel or this piece of literature meaning X? What's the threshold, and why is it there? Why is it that point versus another point? And what is the language that was made and constructed to get us to that threshold? So I think where we can translate or have a conversation across fields like cultural theory and architecture is to say we're also struggling with the fact that after you have certain breakthroughs in technology and certain kinds of interventions in terms of programming of buildings and flexibilities that came with modernism, suddenly a church doesn't have to have the constituent components and language that we thought of in the 17th century to be a church in the 20th century. And so they're already there is a breakdown of some of those constituent parts as we knew them, but we can begin to be more flexible, more porous, and open up other kinds of meanings in the wake of that.
No, for sure. And I think what you've just mentioned is precisely, I think, the ways in which different conceptions of the world change depending on where you're looking, right, in terms of how you're understanding or analyzing the world. And I think this is where JM Coetzee kind of comes in for me, in the sense of, so historically in South Africa, JM Coetzee does a very, very scathing literary criticism of white South African writing. And he's necessarily pointing to this question of language, and necessarily a language whereby the landscape, as he calls it, would be able to speak of itself. So he says, quite aside from the question of whether it is practical for a European to enter African culture in sufficient depth, quite aside from European doubts about whether the black man anyhow appreciates the landscape into which he was born any better than an animal does, the question has to be rephrased. Is there a language in which people of European identity, or if not European identity, then of a highly problematical South African colonial identity, can speak of Africa and be spoken to by Africa? And I want to rephrase that question in the context of our conversation, Milton, to say, in the context of some of the work that you're doing, and I think we're going to get into this later on in the conversation, where we're thinking about specifically black architectural theory, has it been possible, from your perspective, do you think, for specifically black architects, scholars of blackness who are working in architectural theory, to articulate a particular language in which architectural space and the ways in which we organize our society in the United States can speak to the lived realities of African Americans? Has that been a movement that you've observed in the work that's been coming out of whether it is contemporary theory, whether it is theory that might have been coming out or burgeoning in the 20th century from other disciplinary perspectives, not necessarily located in architecture, but has there been that move that facilitates, I would say, maybe an authentic, JM Coetzee calls it an Adamic language, right? Specifically in the South African context, he says that there needs to be this Adamic language where the landscape speaks with its own language. And he also talks about this notion of where there is no distinction between the signifier and the signified. And so the question that I want to pose to you, pointedly, is to say, has there been that move in your observation, specifically one who's speaking as a practitioner, but also a teacher, and also an administrator, right? In the sense of having led a particular school, one of the second largest schools of architecture and design in the country. Have you seen that move? And if not, how do we best maybe try to get there, to see a move whereby architectural theory as well as design can begin articulating the realities of African Americans?
Well, thanks. Very loaded question, very complex one. I think the short answer is yes and no. I think that I think goes back to the language issue. I think that many of my contemporaries, who I think in our generation have begun to question the tenets upon which we were educated, that wasn't necessarily happening at every moment in our history, and certainly amongst architects of Black descent or Indigenous descent or Latino descent, all the various populations that have been so heavily influenced and impacted by enslavement, marginalization, et cetera, particularly in the U.S. American context. So I think we're at the generation where we're beginning to, and generations coming after me, beginning to openly, and I would say intelligently and in a very sophisticated way, to question the tenets upon which we have been and are educated. Meaning, European modernism is at the root of the American architectural pedagogy.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we're at a point where there's, I think, two constructive things happening. One is there's a textual deconstruction happening of the intellectual tenets of European modernism from the point of view of scholars coming at it from a variety of perspectives, some more historical, some more theoretical, and some more practice-based. At the same time, we have practitioners and those who are working between architectural practice, architectural installation, and contemporary art, questioning it from that perspective. And we have a small number of contemporary artists, some of whom were educated or have had influences and conversations, rich conversations with people involved in spatial practice. They're beginning to come into this conversation as well. So I think we're at a very interesting moment where I think that kind of questioning is happening of language. And I think it's cutting to the core of what you're asking. Can we see an emergence of an aesthetic or aesthetics or ways of approaching aesthetics that open up really new, fresh terrain for rethinking space and all of the things that cascade from that, thinking about the typology of buildings as well as community development. Some of these have to do with reparations, repairing, going to the sites and geographies and landscapes where we need extraordinary repair in communities that have been segregated or sublimated to second-class conditions, whether it be housing or environmental racism, et cetera. So I think we're at a very important point. I think that's why, for me, it's important to kind of name this subfield that I term architecture race theory, not so different from critical race theory, and aspiring to the kind of impact that has had within the legal profession, notwithstanding the current assaults on that. Those are to be expected. But I think that's had an amazing impact on a whole generation, multiple generations of thinkers in law who've gone on to practice and teach that has influenced the legal field. And I think we have been doing, I don't want to suggest that work has not been done, but I think we're at a tipping point here where we're ready to really have an emergence of explorations that can be very wide-ranging and vary in scale and hopefully have tremendous impact on the entire field.
No, for sure. And I think this, again, takes me quite nicely to another question that I have, returning back to that consideration of the aesthetic and the aesthetic as apolitical, ahistorical. And I think to a certain extent you've kind of suggested this a bit in your response, but I'd like you to say more about the fact that, historically we could afford, right, to have that bifurcation between the discipline and the political. And I wonder if you could say more about what it means for us now to kind of, with a certain sense of immediacy, attend to the marriage of those two categories, right? Whether it be in the sense of the discipline and the political, and what that would mean for the prospective futures of American society, but not only American society, and I use American society because I think it shares something quite close and similar to the South African society, which is the fact of racial histories, very, very painful racial histories. But what does it mean for us to marry those two? Because, part of what how I had phrased the question before was to say who can afford this bifurcation between the discipline and the political. But I think we've covered that terrain, so what I would then like to sort of consider is the question of what does it mean or what potentials are held in addressing these two components as one, especially in societies that have been defined by such incredible histories of violence, oppression, and of course the dehumanization of particular peoples as a result of building these societies. So, what would it mean for us to combine, for instance, the aesthetic with the political?
Well, we're in a situation globally, and the United States is example A, where it's no longer a luxury to be passive as a polity, as a political entity. And in this country, which is a democracy, um, each person is a political entity. They have a vote, and I think that what we're seeing, or what we've seen globally, play out in Brazil, in Hungary, in the United States, is that it's no longer a luxury to believe that democracies are going to be sustained by magical thinking. They have to be sustained by political activity, political action, and therefore the notion that you've linked the democracy to certain kinds of freedoms that you enjoy, and you've linked those freedoms to being human, and you've had the ability to be passive and take as a luxury that those are going to continue to exist, regardless of what other political or societal issues are taking place outside of your compound or your insulated life. That's simply not the case today, because politics and societal issues are touching upon every sector of our society, economy, and obviously impacting the world on the global dimension. So I think what formerly enslaved Black diaspora subjects understand very clearly is that dehumanization is at the core of our notion of what it means to be human and what it means to be humane. And I think when we start to bring forth and connect with allies who understand, are conscious, and are conscious of the fact that dehumanization is the biggest threat to humanity. Mm-hmm. And when you put people in communities where they're suffering, where they need not be suffering because the resources are there to ameliorate the suffering, but for the greed, or but for the tremendous inequities that have come through the kind of systems that we've undergirded and sustained and put forth through, whether it be capitalism or other forms of economic systems that we are under, have made those conditions not only possible but predictable. Mm-hmm. We understand that dehumanization is at the core of that, and that these activities to link the political with everything else, that's not a luxury. That's actually a basic tenet of being human, and of making good on the promise, at least with democracies, that every human being deserves, has certain inalienable rights. Mm. And given the scope of where we've come as a society, as a global society, what things are possible. I think, I look at a lot of egalitarianism, and trying to kind of think about that tradition of, what does democracy demand?
Yeah.
What does the moment demand of us, of me? And I think there's no room to move outside of the political, and in order to kind of make good on these, and not only creating inalienable rights for all people, but also making those rights palpable and available.
No, for sure. And I think you're stitching quite nicely here, Milton. Quite a lot of the concerns, right, that this particular project, the Black Archive project, is trying to articulate, part of which is to say, how do we use our disciplines and how do we use theory to reconceptualize the world, but then linking that quite directly to, exactly as you say, that we no longer afforded the luxuries of, conceptualizing our democracies as something that exists aside of our active participation in the realization of those democratic goals and objectives. And I think then that this brings me to a point to say that your project has real implications for the process of reimagining then the university, right? Because as you've said, that we cannot divorce the aesthetic from the political. We cannot divorce the political from anything that we're doing at the moment because of the real challenges that our societies are facing. And I wonder if, in thinking about the fact that we cannot divorce the political from everything that we're doing, could you tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing and the work that you're thinking about in terms of the place of the university, whether it be from the discipline of architecture or more broadly art history and art theory, thinking about how the university begins to respond to and intervene in particular, permutations of how the world is ordered, right? So I'm thinking here about, for instance, the work that you gave a talk here at Harvard last year, and it was, in fact, that's what actually got us talking. And that talk was quite amazing because in it you were suggesting that, sure, we've got the discipline, but the discipline cannot be divorced from the realities of society. And that then requires the reimagination or reconceptualization of how we not only structure the discipline, but also the project of teaching in the discipline. And that then has implications, of course, for the university. So I wonder if you would just share a bit briefly about that to say, how do you think about those interconnections, society, the discipline of architecture, and how the discipline of architecture is producing architects who are themselves responsive to the social conditions into which they are stepping out as practitioners?
Sure. Well, I think universities, and I go to James Angle, the former president of the University of Michigan, and other presidents who've long since passed of universities who talked about the university as a democratic project, talked about the university as the most accessible place on earth, really driving home the aspiration that the university is a place of a contestation of ideas, but it's also a place where persons become acquainted with other persons at the same time, simultaneously, that they're becoming acquainted with broad intellectual thought, and in some cases very specific and siloed knowledge that might have to do with a very specific discipline. But that's all happening simultaneously. So the socialization of the citizen is happening at the same time that they're becoming intellectual beings in a way. Not that they, people come to universities as babies ill-formed, but that there's a tremendous degree of intellectual formation that happens within a short, targeted period of time, with specifically designed intervention points called courses and other kinds of extracurricular activities and academic learning that happens outside the classroom. So it's a very unique environment. But I think if we see the university primarily as a democratic project, not as a business, of course its business principles apply to various ways that universities run, but I think the primary role of a university is not to be a business and to make money. It is to be a place of democratic aspiration, meeting the intellectual ideals that you have for extending and innovating and experimenting with truth and knowledge in ways that allow us to imagine new futures, to imagine new societies, and to think about how we can live together. So I think that with that as a basis, we have come to the point where universities in some ways are functioning too much like for-profit businesses. And some of those principles that need to be applied to certain kinds of financial management and things like that have been taken too far and begin to kind of erode a kind of compact that we have amongst each other, whether whether it be with compensation or exploitation, as we define it through labor laws and things like that. And so I think we have to really think very deeply about where we are. In some cases, universities are in a position that has not been of their own doing. When you think of state universities, I've worked, have taught at state universities, very good ones, where by no fault of their own, the funding has been slashed from the states themselves, leaving them to kind of fend for themselves, and the over-reliance on tuition, the arms race for higher tuition, and then the discount rate. It all plays into kind of a cycle that, unfortunately, the neoliberal construct of where we are in this country has put these universities into, and that itself is a predicate for the kind of erosion of social compacts that we want to have at the university, that get us out of these kind of fights that you see people getting in some of these for-profit businesses where there's an extreme relationship between the enrichment of the very few and the care and feeding of employees and workers and staff and things like that. So fortunately, that's a condition that we have to deal with. But on the pedagogical side, I also think that that we've become a little bit arrogant around the elitism of our universities and the rhetoric. We've begun to believe some of our own rhetoric of innovation and outreach and all these things. But when you actually look under the curtain, we want to control everything.
Yeah.
And so I think we're going to have to seek control at the same time that we link ourselves to some of the communities that we are serving, or saying that we're serving. And I think with respect to architecture, we have to begin to make the university itself more porous. When I go to design reviews, whether it's at Ivy League universities or my own here in Los Angeles, a lot of times it's well-educated, urban professionals who are homogenous, if not in their cultural identity, or homogenous in their upbringing and potentially even their class status that they came from before they went into the profession of architecture. And that's it. There won't be any community activists on the panels or in the juries looking at student work. There won't be any people who are with community organizations that have a stake, that are stakeholders in what happens in various communities. And in some cases, the projects themselves are not dealing with issues that are resonating in the public mind today. And it doesn't mean that every single project has to be a quote community project, but the idea that that projects that we're putting on students' desks to deal with in architecture school are not rich enough to handle, or not robust enough pedagogically to handle the kind of conditions that we're seeing just outside of the university, in some cases not 200 feet, 300 feet. That's just, I think, embarrassing for a discipline and a profession that are trying, I think, with the best aspirations to work on behalf of the public good. And so I think that porosity can happen in a number of different ways. And I think you can, with that knowledge exchange, I think you can be intellectually generous at the same time that you're drawing from talents and ideas and experiences of those who are living, breathing in communities where we're trying to allegedly create, students who can do projects in those communities and make those communities better.
Now, Milton, I'll ask you a pointed question here, which is to say, and I think it's not only in the discipline of architecture. I teach philosophy, and sometimes I do worry that my students don't see maybe the value of the skills that they're acquiring in the philosophy classroom. And not only don't they see the value, but they also, fail to apply that knowledge to their local communities in terms of being responsive to the challenges that they're encountering. But you said something that I think kind of threw me off guard there in what you said, where you're saying we're producing graduates who can't even respond to the local challenges of their immediate communities. And I'm wondering, and I say this because I think what the world has done, what globalization has done, and I think you've also kind of intimated toward this in part of your contribution. You've suggested that there's been this incredible globalization that's happened, and the American university really is the university that you're going to find in Chile. It's the same university that you're going to find in South Africa. It's the same university that you're going to find in the United Kingdom, in Germany, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this kind of corporatized institution that runs as if it's a for-profit organization that to a very large extent has kind of forgotten its allegiance to the pursuit of truth and knowledge, right? So in the context of that, in the context of globalization, and I bring this up to suggest that it's not only Professor Milton Curry who's producing a student that he believes is not able to respond to his context, but you can replicate exactly that same situation, and you're going to find it in Johannesburg, right? At a university in Johannesburg, or at a university in Sao Paulo, or at a university in Exeter, right? You're going to find exactly the same challenges where I think all of us who are part and parcel of academia are going to say our students are failing to respond. And I wonder if we can, and if we do say we're going to take responsibility for that, how do we begin to do that? Is it, for instance, the way in which we teach? Is it the way in which we curriculate? Is it the kinds of questions we're asking about our discipline or about our disciplines, and about the kinds of interventions that our disciplines are able to make in society? Or is it about the kind of orientation of the student that we get in the classroom? Because I will admit that some of my students will often say to me that the reading is too, intense, it's too heavy, they've got other courses that they're covering. So how does one balance all of this, especially in the corporatized university where, and it's lovely that I'm asking you this as a former dean, because I think you're going to be very well positioned to answer this question, where administrators are looking for the fact that senior executive managers of the university want to see students succeeding. They want to see pass rates that are consistently going up. They want to see successful students. The idea of, you come to this particular university and you can insert any name of any university you want there, whether it be a UCT, whether it be a Harvard University, whether it be a Princeton. You come to this institution and you succeed, right? This is what we're selling to students. But how do you succeed as a student when you're not necessarily pulling your weight in the program that you're registered for? So I guess I was just struck by what you said when you said, we're producing students who cannot respond to even their immediate surroundings and challenges. And I wonder how we could be responding to that as academics, as I say, across the globe, because that's a challenge that we're facing all across the world.
Sure. So a couple of tangible things first that I've done. Number one, I think because our public school systems in this country are so abysmal, by and large, I've very specifically when I was at the University of Michigan and here at USC, I brought the high school students into the university orbit. And so literally at USC, we have a high school enrichment program oriented around a pedagogy that's architecture focused and architecture integrated, but we're dealing with geometry, we're dealing with social issues, et cetera. And they're embedded within a classroom on our campus for 3 hours a day, half of their school day as juniors in high school, public schools in LA, for an entire semester of their junior year. And you say, we did the same thing at Michigan, except we embedded students in a classroom that we built in Detroit, 45 minutes from the University of Michigan campus where the architecture and urban planning school are situated. But in both cases, you ask, why are your top tier elite university, why are you getting involved in high school education?
Mm-hmm.
And here's the answer. Number one, we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
But we fail to take the radical transform. About 3% of American registered architects are Black American. I think when I was a junior high school, that number was 1.5%. So, wow, we've gone from 1.5 to 3% in some 40 years. Not a very good example to set for the next generation. So, I think that what I found in dealing with high school students is, number one, it put me in touch directly with students and their parents who, with parents who are making $30,000 a year, sitting next to parents who are making maybe $200,000 a year. But guess what? In a place like Detroit, both of those parents, neither of them can afford to send their kid to a private school because the generational wealth of the family where they're making an annual income of $200,000, they don't have the financial cushion to afford the private schools in the metro region that they can drive to or get their kids to through public transportation. So their kid is sitting in the classroom with the kid whose parents are making $30,000. And it put me in touch with, instead of the stereotypes of poverty, the reality of poverty, which is in certain conversations, I couldn't tell you who's making what because they're just as conscientious about what they're doing to raise their kids, and they're just as aspirational. And so I found that to be really incredible. The other thing is that I found that the students, very little of what we do in academia is rocket science. Maybe just rocket science is rocket science. Everything is learnable.
Yeah.
And I think we have this idea that when we get to these elite institutions, only a very small subset can really understand the complexity of what's going on. And the reality is, it's just not true. When we would finish the semesters of these programs, I look at the student work from high school students in their junior year. Some of it would be better than freshman work that I had seen or would see at universities across some of the best universities across the country. And by saying that, I'm not saying, again, the interpretation might be that the freshman work of students is really poor. It's actually the opposite. It's that the work of these high school students was really quite sophisticated, partially due to their own confidence and their own ability to learn and adapt and apply, but also the pedagogy that was in front of them. And so I think that we have to understand that, yes, we're teaching a lot of kids to go to these private schools, but really everything is learnable, and there should be much more, a much more expansive set of opportunities out there because the ability and capacity can be taught. And so that's just one example, a very tangible example. But I think, we also haven't committed to radically diversifying our faculties. And that's hurting the pedagogy as well because we just don't have the people with the life experiences to teach and to, whether it's philosophy or architecture, you've got to come at these things from who you are. And if who you are is homogenous, you're never going to cut through some of the thresholds of looking at something with a fresh perspective that you need to. And so that's something that I think is also something that we've talked about. We've had committees on, but I think we haven't committed to radically diversifying the academy. And that might mean looking at the kind of qualifications that it takes, and it also might mean looking at the kind of mentoring and other kind of PhD programs and master's programs and the kind of incentives that we set forth as we try to do that work. Again, I give you an example of starting in high school. I could take the same example and say, why aren't we going to undergrad and really impress upon people that we want to mentor you to do graduate degrees. Some cases that happens, but it's not wide ranging.
No, for sure. And I think, Milton, this is going to bring me to the concluding question around our discussion today. And there's really quite a lot that you said, and I wish we could kind of sit with it and really kind of unpack all of it. But I think one of the critical things that I'm thinking about is necessarily the strategic interventions that we're putting forward as faculty, as universities, but specifically as the humanities, because I think what has happened with the corporatization of the university, what Bill Reddings called, the university in ruins in 1996, what has happened is that the humanities have, to a very large extent, languished, precisely because people have been resistant to critical race theory, for example. And a lot of the work that has come as a result of the humanities opening up and accepting individuals or people who weren't there, say, for instance, a century before. So this is 19th, 18th, 17th centuries, right? So women come into the academy, black folk come into the academy, and these are people, as you say, necessarily bring very, very different perspectives to reading a discipline, whether it be literature, whether it be music, whether it be architecture, whether it be philosophy. And as part of that commitment to the diversification, to the continued diversification of the university, I wonder how you would say, or what you would make rather, of the role of this sort of intercontinental conversation that we're having here. Because in as much as I am located at this very moment at a university in the north, I am a scholar from the south who has deep commitments and deep affinities with the kinds of intellectual scholarship and community that is happening in the global south, whether it be on the African continent, in the South Americas, or in Indonesia. And I wonder what your perspective would be, or your take would be, on the proposition that we need to sort of reignite the conversation between the communities situated on either side of the Atlantic, right? And whether this would facilitate part and parcel of the response. And as I say, the reason why I'm making the suggestion is based on the fact that what has become the American university, and again, Bill Reddings, I think, synthesizes and articulates this quite well, the experiment that was Harvard University against the Kantian University of Reason and Philosophy in Germany, against the University of Letters in the United Kingdom, what becomes Harvard University and the experiment of innovation with canon, of the invention of canon, becomes this idea that gets exported across the world as we are all inventing our own traditions and our own intellectual histories and genealogies. So what then becomes the role of intercontinental discussion? And how do you perceive the role of intercontinental discussion and collaboration in allowing us to respond to the deep global crisis of knowledge, where knowledge has become a commodity? Understandably, in a knowledge economy, knowledge will become commodified, but it has become a commodity to the extent of being perverted, right? Where particular communities are gated out of knowledge, where we are unable to adapt and develop innovative and responsive systems to global crises because, knowledge has become so commodified. So in your perspective, what do you think becomes the role of intercontinental conversation between Africa and her diasporic communities?
Well, I think there's a couple of things before, there's a couple of predicates before we get there. One is kind of, things that are flashing across my mind as you ask that question. One is Spivak, how does the subaltern speak?
Mm-hmm.
I also think about African theorists such as Frantz Fanon or B.Y. Mudimbe, who are speaking about, liberation and colonization and trying to wrap their minds around how you get outside of that. And I think also in our Black radicals tradition here in the United States, people like C.L.R. James and Angela Davis, who are very much alive and well in the current discourse around abolition and prisons and things like that, amongst other things. And so I think these are enormously rich traditions to draw upon. And I think that the U.S. has exported a lot. You talked about universities as being, a format that has been exported. But I also think the civil rights movement and the Black radical tradition in the United States is perhaps one of the most consistent and comprehensive in terms of conceptualizing a way out of the colonial conditions that one finds themselves in. And so I think linking to that and understanding that the university can't be an assimilationist project. I think when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of times it's around bringing people in from various backgrounds and then, teaching them what it means to be a middle-class American with the right values and the right disposition. And I think in some ways our focus on STEM has in a way been dehumanizing. The idea that science, technology, math has no relation to politics or society, I think that's ludicrous. I'm not saying everybody has said that, but I think the overall emphasis vis-a-vis the humanities has been one that let's do something that's quantifiable that gets us to the knowable, and then to a kind of transfer of knowledge that then can be monetized. And so I think that here we are with chatbots and artificial intelligence at our door, and right back to the humanities, thinking, what does it mean to write something? What does it mean to have intentionality? What does it mean to create something as a human? What does being human mean? We're right back at the humanities. And so I think we dismiss the humanities always at our own peril because we need them so desperately. And I would include the arts in that, because the arts always offer a kind of the ability to open up language in a very visceral way that can happen, I think, on a different framework and trajectory and time frame than maybe textual evolutions of types of text or types of writing. But getting back to, with that as a predicate, I think getting to what you said, I think that when we put these tensions in play between the global South and the North, or Africa and the U.S., or Latin America and the U.S., I think these are productive because it allows us to see what has been shared, what the results of that, we can analyze that. And then now at this moment, kind of where we see the ability to redirect and to have some correction. And there might be some globality in that. There might be also a heavily localized way of dealing with that, or that response as well. But I think it's productive. I have been more involved in Latin America and the Americas than Africa, but it's always been there in my mind. And I think as I read authors and theorists, it looms large, and I think it should, because it's got such a powerful generative and catalytic impact on world making. And I think that's the perspective which I would, which I would pursue that conversation with is as you kind of started our conversation, is world making. I mean, when you are the cradle of the universe, the cradle of the human existence, that's, I think, the starting point. And so I think there are a lot of interesting corollaries between what we're trying to do in the United States and what you and your thinking is doing relative to South Africa and other parts of the continent.
Thank you, Milton. And on that note, I really would like to express deep gratitude for taking the time to join us today, Professor Milton Curry, and to exchange incredible ideas. And I think this is a conversation that will continue. It is not a conversation that will stop here today. And the collaborations that come out of this conversation, I am excited for them, specifically to see what kind of critical interventions these interdisciplinary conversations that we're having as part and parcel of the Black Archive Visual Podcast will spark and initiate. So thank you very much, Professor Curry, for your time.
Thank you. It's been great to speak with you, and thanks for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.